Welcome everyone to this Data for Good meetup this evening featuring the STARS Air Ambulance and leveraging data. Kirk Schmidt will be presenting to us here shortly. I just wanted to give a bit of background on Data for Good for those of you that may be new to the group. So we're a group of volunteers who use our data-related skills for good. Our aim is to help nonprofit and social organizations harness the power of their data to really leverage their impact in the community. And the Calgary chapter, we're part of a national not-for-profit organization, 9 chapters across the country, all the way from Vancouver to Halifax. We have thousands of members and have helped many organizations at events over the course of the years that we've been around. So in Calgary, we started Data for Good here in 2013. We have over 1,900 members now, and yeah, which is fantastic. We have our monthly meetups on the third Thursday of the month. And then we also have events. So we do larger events called datathons with organizations that tend to have a lot of data. And in better times, we do those face-to-face on a Friday night, all day Saturday and Sunday morning. These days, we have done some virtual datathons, and we'll continue to do that. We also help smaller organizations on projects that they might have through our volunteer data corps, and so often we'll have these groups come to us and present their challenges or issue they're having, and get a group of you as volunteers to volunteer to help them out. So please pass the word on about Data for Good and get your friends to sign up on Meetup. We have a Twitter handle at DataForGoodYYC, as well as our national website, DataForGood.ca. So over the years, these are some of the organizations that we've helped work with in Calgary, as well as other organizations across the country. And this year, we are partnered with the Calgary Homeless Foundation. They have an amazing set of data called HMIS, which is their homelessness management information system. And we've been working with them to really try to understand that data, kind of pull it into an analytic environment, fully anonymize the data, and then would make it available at our datathon. So we want to do that and kind of do the big picture, the in-person datathon, hopefully in the spring, but we are contemplating doing a kind of a mini virtual datathon sometime later this year. So we'll keep you posted as that develops. So without further ado, at this point, I'd like to introduce Kirk Schmidt and from STARS Air Ambulance. And Kirk, we can get you started then with your sharing the screen and your presentation, and I'll get you to kind of give your background and kind of do your introduction, and so we can get it right and get the full picture.
Sounds good. Thanks. I'll share it right now. Hi, everybody. Thank you very much to Data for Good for inviting me to do this talk. I do come from STARS Air Ambulance. I think most of you probably know what we do, but to just give you a super high-level overview, we are a not-for-profit that was started in 1985, and it was started with the mission of one life lost is too many. There is a difficulty sometimes getting to medical care in rural areas, or especially specialized medical care in rural areas. So Stars Air Ambulance has 6 bases throughout the 3 provinces of Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba, and we provide effectively critical care in the air. We are basically a movable ICU to some degree, and we go out, we pick up patients either from hospitals or from scene calls, and we bring them to care. I come from the fundraising side of STARS. So I'll give you a little bit about my background. I am currently the Director of Operations for the Foundation for STARS. So STARS really has multiple components. I like to think of it as 4 businesses, really. So there is obviously the aviation component, the clinical component. We have our own, effectively a 911 call center. It's our emergency link center. So we have that, and then we have the foundation, which is tasked with fundraising the money that we need to actually run all of those operations annually. I've been working in the charitable sector since 2007, but I joined STARS in March of 2018, right before the Humboldt Broncos incident, which was a massive tragedy for us. And it was something that STARS was involved with, and it was very obvious as I came into STARS into that how what an amazing organization I was able to join. In my years prior to STARS, I spent 8 of them consulting. So I consulted on data and analytics, and those of you who have done datathons, especially for any nonprofits who have used Raiser's Edge, you would basically know that that is my life. Raiser's Edge is basically what I have spent my time in charities working with, and that's basically what I consulted on over the years. I do have a Bachelor of Mathematics, so even though I am a fundraiser, I do come from a mathematical and statistical background, which makes for a fantastic combination. But as I said, I am first and foremost a fundraiser. And so the lens I'm going to look at this with today is really from that fundraising lens. I am responsible for the annual giving team. That's the team that does the direct mail, the online component, tribute giving, all sorts of things like that. And that team is responsible for over $5 million of revenue per year. And we rely heavily on data. So hopefully, as I talk today, you'll kind of see where we use that and how effectively we can move forward with it. I do have a few philosophies from my time in nonprofits. First of all, small changes are far better than large scale analytics. There is really no use going to machine learning and AI for most charities, because most charities are measuring the smallest things. There are charities out there who really could not at any given time tell you how much money they've raised in a given year. So it's really important to start on the small things and get the small victories for charities before we move to the really cool stuff that probably we all nerd out about. The second is we do need to measure better. Nonprofits are fixated with very specific metrics that aren't particularly useful or aren't useful in the way that they think that they're useful for. So really the nonprofit sector does need more thought leaders in nonprofit analytics. And it is definitely an area that we're seeing a lot of growth. So those of you who are out there who have been doing this data for good thing for a while, always be on the lookout for the sector and what we're looking for in terms of data and analytics, because it is becoming more prolific. And it's really important that we have people who come in who understand far more than simply, how to pull an average gift. And then the other thing is machine learning and AI are coming, and we're using them to a large degree in larger charities, but it needs to be on the right things. A lot of the early machine learning and early analysis that was done in the sector is based on a lot of biased data. And I'm going to go into that a little bit more later in what I mean by that, but there's a lot of danger in going that route if we're going the wrong way. So it's really important to take that step back and make sure that we're measuring the right things before we start going into machine learning and AI. Now, what am I going to talk about for the next 45 minutes? I can tell you that I nerd out pretty quickly when it comes to this type of thing, and I could probably, like, if we just picked a topic like the Alberta Stars Lottery, I probably could talk for about 2 hours straight if I wanted to. So I actually ended up rewriting this talk multiple times. And really what I decided to come up with in terms of the theme was really looking at, you're going to probably go out and do work for other charities. And so I thought it would be really beneficial to approach this from the perspective that you kind of would with that datathon piece. What are the problems that we're trying to solve? And what are the things that you need to know about the fundraising world that you might not know? Because as you all know, where you really have strength in analytics is not just knowing the numbers and being able to do the math and the visualizations, but also being able to understand the business component and understand how you can apply that and how the charity can apply that. So I really want to arm you with knowledge so that you can arm nonprofits with more knowledge. I'm going to give some examples of what I've done over my time at STARS so far. So hopefully that sounds of interest to people. If that's not, I'm sure there's a presidential debate you could be watching, but I think this is more fun. So measuring fundraising. When I came into STARS, I of course had been consulting for a number of years. I had actually built a number of R scripts to go into Razor's Edge and to pull out a whole bunch of information out of it that I could use. So actually it was funny, my first 3 days of STARS, I was there and then I went off on vacation for a week and then I came back. So what was really nice is that first few days, what I did is I showed up and I ran R scripts, almost like I came in as a consultant. And it was really neat to just see the data without anybody giving me information of what's going on in the background or just giving me those stories that tend to muddy the data sometimes. And so what I started with, and I moved the slide that I intended to do. So we'll talk about that in a moment. Sorry about that. Little bit about the foundation first. So STARS Foundation, our fundraising side, basically gets revenue from 3 main areas. So the first is philanthropic giving and event fundraising. So that's your main nonprofit fundraising area. And that's what effectively most charities are doing to some degree. Now, there's money that comes from grants, money that comes from government, those types of things. But in terms of the philanthropic and the event fundraising, that is the core component. We have the home lottery. And so this is a lottery that we've been doing since the early 90s. We have a lottery in Alberta and Saskatchewan. They are separate because lottery and gaming rules are provincial in nature. But that brings in a significant amount of revenue for us per year. And then the other thing is we sell merchandise and calendars. And it's actually not a business that most charities are involved in. And you've probably seen different charities do merchandise here and there. The first one that always comes to mind is World Wildlife Foundation. How, when you sign up, quite often you can get a stuffed animal of a particular animal that you're helping to save. So we are similar in nature. We sell merchandise. We have our calendars, which we've been doing for many, many years. We still sell tens of thousands of calendars per year, paper calendars, which was amazing to me when I came into STARS. But the foundation needs to generate roughly $35 million net per year, not gross, but net. That's a lot of money we need to raise in order to do our missions. So data becomes phenomenally important for doing that role. Now, there are 3 things that we care about when we're talking about nonprofit data. And it really comes down to the number of donors that we have, the amount of money we're getting from those donors, and the amount of money we're spending on expenses. Everything we measure is based on those 3 pieces. And even that, it's really only 2. The thing with the number of donors, the things that we care about the most is how many donors are we bringing in every year that are new, and how many donors are we retaining. And those are very similar to any type of business. Those are the 2 most important things when it comes to the number of donors and making sure that the number increases or at least stays the same. In terms of number of or amount of donations, there's a lot of different ways we can measure this, and I'll talk a little bit about this. Donation amounts are really important to understand. With the number of donors that we're going to have, what are we going to bring in per year? And then, of course, there's the expenses, which I will put the robot here. The warning, warning, danger, danger. The one problem with going after charities' expenses is quite often if you're looking at individual components, you're not getting a full picture. And where I like to use this as an example is events. You will probably hear that galas are very expensive to run and tend not to bring in a lot of money. A lot of charities do run them, however. And the reason that we run them is because it's about the experience, it's about education, it's about other things. It's even about acquisition to some degree. You will quite often bring in people to galas who aren't going to necessarily respond to direct mail that they've received in their mailbox. So it's a very expensive way of fundraising if you look at it simply as a revenue generation. And so that's why when you look at amount of expenses, you have to look at it from a larger picture. Does it make sense to cut something? And it becomes really important right now in COVID times, because we're not raising as much money. Charities are struggling because a lot of the main ways that charities raise money has been taken out from us. The idea of the gala is gone, and it's gone for probably the next year at least. So we have to look at where we're cutting expenses, what makes sense. And so that's why I put that warning there, because expenses, it's important to understand, and you all know from business, you need to make sure your expenses are as efficient as possible, but you also have to understand the larger picture, and that's why I put that warning there. Now, everything really follows from these metrics, and really any metrics that we're going to do are hybrids of this information. So I'll go back to the initial assessment. So when I came into STARS, I really focused at it as a consultant. And so I just ran these R scripts and really pulled a whole lot of information. So of course, number of donors per quarter, number of gifts per quarter. It will give you a very good idea of when your spikes are. Now, you're going to always have a spike at the end of the year. That's the way charities work. But it's always interesting to see where the other spikes happen and if it's consistent year over year. So sometimes you might have a single gift that is super large that just shows up the one blip the one year and doesn't show up other years. So being able to do that pattern recognition very quickly of where is the money coming in, when is the money coming in, and is it consistent? A lot of it is also running frequency charts on donations. So I put Pascal's triangle of gift amounts, which was something that I ended up building for myself. And really it was the idea of, I wanted to see the top 1%, the top 2%, the top 4%, the top 8%, 16, 32, 64. Because at each range, there are, you have to double the amount of donors in order to get to the next, get to the same amount of money raised in the next section. So it became a really good idea of understanding where the money lay. Same thing with deciles, percentiles, and per mils. So what I do is I tend to run deciles, the first decile all the way to the 9th, and then the 91st to the 99th percentile, and then the 991st per mil to the 999th per mil. And that just gives a really good idea year over year how much money is shifting. Right? Because you can see as the buckets shift, you can basically see what happened in given years with certain gifts. Similarly, looking at outlier amounts using box and whisker. There's obviously the measures of central tendency, so your mean, median, mode. I like to use something called a Windsorized mean, which is not something a lot of people are aware of. The idea of a Windsorized mean is you have your outlier amounts, your low outlier and your high outlier. And any gifts that lay outside of those amounts, you apply that edge amount to. So let's say your high outlier is $500. You might have 1,000 gifts that are well above $500. But when you're actually figuring out what the Windsorized mean is, you count all of those gifts above as they are $500. The reason it's really important in fundraising is we rely heavily on major gifts. So that's basically gifts that are given by organizations or relatively wealthy individuals who give large amounts. And of course, that can shift your average significantly based on what is happening. This basically, what happens when you Windsorize a mean is you're basically acknowledging, look, we're going to have this many gifts per year. We know they're going to be large gifts, but we don't know what that level is. We don't know if it's going to be $1,000, $10,000, $1 million, or beyond. So we're going to count them as gifts, but we're not going to count that level of impact necessarily. Of course, giving by campaign, giving by method. So do they give online? Do they give via mail? Things like that. So those online gifts. Our retention rates and churn, and I use the S very, very importantly on retention rates. There are a lot of charities that just measure a single retention rate, and it's not quite the full picture. And I'll get into that as well. And then the most frequent gift amounts. So what are we seeing in terms of gifts coming in? And that's really where I'm going to start with my examples, because one of the first things I did was I ran the most frequent gift amounts, and I noticed something very, very similar. So if you look at the top right on my slide here, 2017, 2016, 2015, these are the top 5 gift amounts in order of magnitude. It has not changed. And in fact, even though we made changes to online donation forms, it actually hasn't changed since then in terms of which amounts are in what order. But there were some changes into the levels, and so this was the first change I made, and it was one of the largest impacts. So the donation amounts on our website had not changed since 2012, and I used archive.org to look at old donation pages to confirm that when they had last changed. And the donation amounts were $25, $50, and $100. This is for a charity that, combined with government revenue and everything, we have to raise $65 million a year. So it seems like they're pretty small amounts for a charity that is bringing in a significant number of donations that are actually higher than those. So what we did, we actually ran a significant number of tests. I don't want to say that we just simply added a $250 value and everything worked out. We actually ran a significant number of A/B tests. What we actually did is we took our donation form, we set it so that based on the user's IP address, they would get a different donation form with different amounts. Reason we used IP as opposed to just random sampling is because we wanted to make sure that people who were coming in from the same place saw the same form. So if they went to the donation form, went to a story, came back, that they would still have the same form. And we did all of these tests, and we basically ended up finding that the best thing we could do was add a $250 value. That's it. So we now have 4 donation amounts: 25, 50, 100, and 250. The difference was 40%. We increased online donations by 40% in 1 year. Now, I did say earlier that I came in during the Humboldt year, and obviously we received a lot of support for our contribution to that tragedy. We actually pulled that data out when we did this measurement. So this was outside of any change that year. Now, as I said, the distribution actually, or the values did not change. The distribution changed though. So the difference between the most frequent and the 5th most frequent, the difference halved. So what ended up happening is we got about the same number of $50 donations per year. We got significantly less 10 and 25s and significantly more 20s and 100s. So basically those $10 donors shifted up to 20. Those $20 donors, shifted up, and so on and so forth. And we basically got this distribution shift. There's a lot of work right now being done on donor psychology, and this would be kind of in line with a lot of that, where if you put a larger amount on the donation form, quite often what will happen is people will actually look at that and decide to go higher. And so we basically saw that same effect happening that's being measured in donor psychology these days. So that was the first major change I came in. So this goes back to that philosophy that I was saying. Small changes can make a big impact. We do not need to necessarily do machine learning and AI right away. We can do these small things and move it forward. So moving on to retention. So as I said, retention is really important, but as nonprofits, we tend to simplify retention too much. You tend to see a single retention rate, which would work great if people reacted the same way, regardless of kind of how they came in or how long they have been donors. But that's not quite what happens. In fact, in the industry, new donor retention tends to be somewhere around 20%. Whereas once somebody has been with an organization for a while, that value tends to get closer to 50, 60%. That's a significant drop that you have in that first year. So it's really important when doing any type of analysis with charities that you're actually doing new donor retention as one metric, monthly donor retention. So those are your recurring donors. You want to actually look at them separately because they act completely different than any other donors. And then all of your existing donors you can lump into a group if you're looking at the minimum there. But you can expand it. So you can look at things like repeat donors and how long they've repeated. So whether they've been 2-year donors, 5-year donors, 10-year donors, 20-year donors, or so on. By the way, I saw on the Data for Good datathon that you did for Nature Conservancy, one of the questions was planned giving donors and who the best planned giving donors are. I'm not sure if NCC gave any criteria with that, but in the industry, we know that people who stay with an organization for a long time, regardless of what their gift amount is, tend to be good planned giving donors. So if you ever end up with that question again, what you really should be looking at is people who have been around for 5, 10, 20 years, and especially those who have increased their giving over that time. So you can look at your repeat donors, you can look at your lapsed donors, reactivated monthly, so on and so forth. Now, one of the things I built when I was a consultant and brought to STARS immediately was something I called donor participation coding, which is this lovely table here. And so this is actually going a little bit farther than that new repeat lapsed. And the idea behind this is you start with your most recent year, and you put a G if you got a gift from that donor, and you put an L if they did not give that year, and then you go back a year and so on and so forth, and then you combine the numbers. So G1 on this are new donors. They were brand new last year, and you can see that their retention rate 2013 through 2015 stayed pretty consistent, 29%. So we were able to keep 29% of our new donors every year. Now, if you go down 4 lines to G2, those are people who have given for 2 consecutive years. And you can see how that percentage just went right up. It practically doubled. So 57, 54, 61 given the year. You go up to 3 gifts, G3, so 3 consecutive years of giving. Now you're starting to flirt with the 70% mark. And then the plus is just that they've given for years after that, because obviously you can get into a whole lot of combinations the farther you go out if you did the whole string. But then it gets into really interesting things. So if we go all the way down to all of our L1s, so L1, G1, L1, G1, L1 plus, L1, G2, L1, G2 plus, you will actually see, so these are people who did not give last year. But if they gave for 2 consecutive years the year before, they were much more likely to give than if they only had given us 1 gift, which makes sense, but this actually puts numbers to it. This actually says, look, this is the percentages. So if we look down to the second last line, this is the most compelling one to me, and this is the one that I love. So a lot of times when charities will mail donors, they will go back so many years and then go, okay, we're not gonna mail anybody anymore. So if you go back 3 years, so their last gift was 3 years ago, those will be all of those L2s. So L2 G1, they gave a gift 3 years ago. It was their first gift to the organization, and then they have never given since. You can see our chance of recapturing them is about 9%. But if they have given gifts prior, and that could be that they gave consecutively prior, or they had some gifts, some lapsed, some gifts, some lapsed, either way, it immediately jumps to almost 23% retention rate, or reacquisition rate in this case. So we can actually start to break down these groups going farther back in time and go, okay, it's probably not worth mailing somebody who gave their last gift 4 years ago, unless they gave for 2 consecutive years prior, and so forth. So it becomes a really good way of building efficiency into our solicitation. Sorry, that's being dry, not COVID. another really interesting graph that I brought to STARS, and I've run this on a number of charities, and it's actually kind of crazy how consistent this tends to be with charities. This is the propensity of getting a third gift based on the amount of time between a first gift and a second gift. And so this is a really compelling piece. The one I actually have for STARS actually has the standard deviations on it. I figured I'd just simplify it really quick here, but effectively, the earlier you capture the second gift is the higher likelihood that you will get a third gift. And it's crazy actually how linear that process is until you hit about 72 months. At that point, it just shoots off, partially because you don't have a lot of data to work with, and partially because there's a lot of research to suggest that once a donor has been gone for 5 years, when you capture them again, they kind of act like a new donor again. So this is really interesting from that perspective. One of the things we always look at when doing any type of data analysis is, how do we use this? So, what can STARS do with this type of data? And so we know that there is importance of putting new donors into the normal solicitation track immediately. And this goes against gut. And gut is one of the biggest problems in charities, because charities are full of really nice people who really want to not piss off anybody. So what happens is you go, well, they just gave a gift to us. I don't know if we should be asking them for another gift right away. And the data suggests completely otherwise. So this is where it's important to defend and to argue that, you know what, you got to put them back in the track immediately, and you're trying to capture them early. And then the question is, what other data do we need to know with this? So one of the questions would be, what are the giving amounts? Does it matter if they gave at large amounts, small amounts, things like that? After we do this analysis, then we come up with fundraising decisions. So I'll let you know actually where we're going with things. So we're actually, one of the things that was built in a few years ago was effectively a piece that we send out to new donors the month after they gave. And really it's an information package about STARS, so that they just kind of know all of the different things that we do, not just the helicopter, because let's face it, that's the coolest part, but how we train rural doctors in different procedures, how we use our link center to help patients even if we're not going to send the helicopter. All of those really, really important things that aren't nearly as sexy as the big red machine that you see flying over you. So we sent that out, and then the next piece is we're working on a test to find out when the ideal time is to send a solicitation after that. So we don't actually put them into the normal solicitation track right away. What we're doing is we're staggering the months after that initial piece that we send them, and we're providing a solicitation after that and seeing what works. And really what we're really focused on is capturing monthly donors, because monthly donors, of course, not only are you guaranteeing your second gift, you're guaranteeing your third and quite often 5-10 years into the future of giving. In fact, we know generally at STARS that for every dollar that we get in monthly giving, that will probably be worth about 100 times that value in terms of maintaining that donor and the amounts that they change over time. Acquisition. So as I talked about, number of donors is really important. Unfortunately, you are always going to lose donors, and some of it is natural. People do pass away. If there is a zombie charity out there, that might be the only one that doesn't have to deal with that. Apart from that, we have to deal with the fact that people change charities, people move, people pass away. There's a lot of reasons why people cease to give, and so it's really important to replace that donor pool. Now acquisition is always a contentious topic in charities, because acquisition will almost always lose money the year that you're doing the acquisition. And so that's very much a turnoff against any type of investment, because if you're going to spend $100,000 and know that you're only going to get 50,000 back this year, that's a really difficult argument to make. But we know a few things. So we know year-over-year retention rate increases the longer somebody has been retained. And you saw that with that donor participation coding. The longer somebody has been giving, the more likely they are to give the next year. Another interesting thing happens with giving. So year-over-year giving increases the longer someone has been retained. In fact, it has actually a very, very interesting curve to it. It's almost logarithmic in nature. It has a very sharp uptake the first year, and then it really it becomes almost asymptotic as it reaches the peak. And it costs money to acquire and maintain a donor. So unfortunately, people don't just give without us asking. The most likely way to get a gift is to ask. So what we need to do is we always need to be asking and reminding the donor that we're there, and telling them about the newest stories and what we're doing. And so it costs money to do that. So what we need to do is we need to figure out if an acquisition channel is actually making money. So these are those graphs that I was telling you about. So this is the gift change and the cumulative retention rate. So what I mean by cumulative retention rate is in year one, we maintained or we retained a certain number. In year two, so 2 years after somebody's gift, we then retained a smaller percentage because we had the first group that was retained the first year, and then a smaller percentage of that was retained, so on and so forth. And it turns out that they're, if you model them in particular ways, the one on the left, I believe, is y is equal to a over x, and the one on the right is just a negative exponential curve. It tends to be very close to what actually happens, and it becomes a really good way to model it. So I developed this. This is those two, along with the costs of doing the initial acquisition, the cost of maintaining the donor, and the likelihood of when you send out an acquisition piece, what is the likelihood of actually getting a gift, and what is that gift amount? And basically, all it's doing is running these numbers in perpetuity to find out what's going on. So S and T are the gift amount changes. A and B are the retention rate changes. P is the likelihood of the acquisition getting a donor. G is the gift amount. And then M1 and M2 are your costs, your initial year cost and your ongoing yearly cost. So I used this a couple of years ago. I went to my bosses and went, I need to double my budget, which, as you can imagine, a charity that, we have to be good with expenses. That's a super hard sell. And it really came down to, I had to basically pull up this, and I had to say, okay, so in year one, we're going to spend this, we're going to get this amount back. Year two, this is how much we're going to get, this is how much we're going to spend, so on and so forth, and show that over time, we were actually going to get a 40% return on investment on every dollar that we spent. So as I said, that was 2 years ago. So last year was our acquisition year. This year is our first retention year. And right now, the numbers are suggesting that we are going to be 96% of the value that was predicted, which, given the year we've had, that makes me really happy. So being able to show long-term what the effects are, being able to model it, becomes really important for making those strategic investments. And of course, we decided with this not only what to acquire, but how we acquired, right? We didn't look just at acquisition as a big blob, but of course we cohorted it in terms of, what if we acquired this way? What is the likelihood of getting a donation? If we acquire this way, what is the likelihood of getting a donation? And rerunning this. And luckily, I've just thrown this into Excel now, so I just plug in the numbers and it goes. I don't have to do the calculation anymore. The lottery. So as I said, I could probably talk for 2 hours about the lottery. I'm not going to get into super specifics with what we do with modeling the lottery, but I will tell you a few things about what it has allowed us to do. So the home lotteries in Alberta and Saskatchewan account for about $12,000 of our net fundraising, or sorry, $12 million of our net fundraising. It is the single largest fundraising program that we run. Each lottery runs for 3 months, and there are 3 phases. There's the loyalty phase, so that's where anybody who has been a previous supporter gets mailed the initial, hey, the lottery's on again, you should buy a ticket. Then we go into the early bird, which is the first phase, and there's always a special early bird prize, and then the general phase, which is the last one. Now, a few things about stars. So in 2013, Charity Intelligence did a study on charity lotteries. At the time, we were the 4th largest charity lottery in Canada, and definitely the largest in the Western provinces, and the 2nd most efficient lottery in Canada, which is something to be very proud of. But the question is always, how do we make it better? Lotteries cost a lot of money because there's a lot of advertising and costs involved. So the more we can predict what will happen with the lottery, the less we have to rely on advertising or put advertising into market too much later on. So as I said, I'm not going to go into specifics of the model, but what's really interesting about lottery in my time here is how consistent it is. And what I mean by that is, you'll usually have a number of ticket packages for your main lottery. You'll have a number of ticket packages for a 50-50. So things like the amount of money spent on 50-50 as a ratio of the amount of money spent on the main lottery stays almost consistent daily, no matter how many purchases we get. So if it's one of the last days of a phase, which you can imagine are massive uptake of sales, like last day of early bird is always a huge spike. It doesn't matter if it's that day or if it's one of the slowest days of the year. That ratio of the amount spent on 50-50 to the amount spent on main varies by a tenth, maybe a few tenths of a cent. It's incredibly predictable. Another thing is how people are going to buy ticket packages. So pretty much within the first few days of a lottery, we can pretty much say, okay, well, we're going to sell out of this ticket package first because this is the way that people are buying this lottery this year. So, kind of some predictions that we were able to do this year. So this was on the Saskatchewan lottery. So on day 2, basically I came forward and said, okay, well, this 50-50 ticket is going to sell out well before the loyalty phase is done. And sure enough, it was. 8 days before that end of the loyalty phase, we predicted the 50-50 would sell out, no problem. And there was a very high chance at that point the main lottery would sell out. Now, at this point, we hadn't received a lot of the mail purchases that we normally expect. So I was being a little bit conservative when I said that. 2 days later, I gave what I called the CFO, the Kirk seal of approval, that we would sell out. And actually 2 days before the end of the loyalty phase, so 4 days later, not only did we predict a sellout, we predicted a sellout before the end of the early bird phase. And that's exactly what happened. Roughly a week and a half, 2 weeks before the end of the early bird phase, we ended up selling out. So being able to model the lottery, one of the nice things is we knew well in advance that we could pull all of the advertising that we had planned for the general phase. We didn't have to spend that money. So we knew that we were going to maximize our income, and we could start minimizing our expenses. So that's where things like that become really important in fundraising there. Now, machine learning. So obviously I gave my warnings about machine learning, and I'll give you more warnings about machine learning, but I'll tell you a little bit about what we're doing with STARS. A lot of machine learning and AI in the sector has been based on predicting who the best donors are. And so, as I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of bias in that. And what you have to remember is early fundraising, early major gift fundraising, so those large donors, usually came out from an individual fundraiser or group of fundraisers going through their system and going, okay, well, this person we recognize their name, this person we, they're doing these things that we think, they're ready for a major gift, so we're going to go forward with that. And then, of course, because that demographic tended to be very static, as you can imagine. It was middle-aged white male, usually CEOs of companies type situation. Those became kind of the people that people went after. And so as people started to build analytics models before the whole machine learning point, consulting firms were going, you know what, we can help you pick your best donors. And it was always based on certain markers that were very indicative of that particular group. And what would happen is fundraisers would go out, they'd have these meetings with people, and sure enough, you have enough meetings with people who have lots of money, and you end up getting money in. So the problem is that these machine learning algorithms and AI algorithms are all looking at historically how we have gone after major gift donors, but it is very biased in its nature. So I'm very reticent to go down that path too much. It works to a degree, but it also propagates ideas that are not necessarily true. But one of the tools we're using is actually, it actually predicts the donor's next gift based on pattern of giving. So it looks at how people have given, when people change their giving amounts, how quickly they're giving, the acceleration of giving, that type of thing. And it uses that to determine the next giving amount. And that to me makes sense from a machine learning algorithm, because it effectively becomes agnostic to a lot of the demographic information that a lot of analysis goes through. And it's not to say demographic is bad, but patterns of behavior tend to be far more predictable from my experience in the fundraising sector. The thing that I also warn about with machine learning and AI in the sector is, and hopefully groups like you can help solve this problem, it does create a separation of haves and have-nots. I can tell you the organizations that are using machine learning and AI are universities and hospital foundations for the most part, because they are the ones who have the most money. And so you can imagine when they adopt these, they of course get more efficient, they get better at fundraising, they're better at going after, to a large degree, the same donors that these smaller organizations are going for, but don't have the tools, technology, or know-how to be able to use these types of things. So it's a really dangerous thing for the charitable sector, just in terms of that piece. I think eventually we are going to have a very prescriptive method of soliciting donors. The example I love to use is that at some point we will probably know whether or not a particular donor is a Calgary Flames fan, and we will know that, or the algorithm will know that the Flames won last night, so you will have a 0.01% higher chance of securing that gift today than you would if they lose. And it will just start being prescriptive in terms of, hey, you need to phone this donor today because they're going to be ecstatic. Flames just won the Stanley Cup, like, get this donor on the phone. They are going to just give you a whole bunch of more money than they normally would have. So I think there's going to be that piece. And where machine learning is going to be really helpful in charities is going to be the automation of tasks. Donation entry is still a very manual process. It requires a lot of people to do, and this goes for every charity. So there's a lot of things where over time we need ways of automating that and use machine learning. But it's not, as I said kind of at the beginning, machine learning I really don't like for picking the best donors. It really is about how can we leverage the data that we do have, to look at behavior and to look at prescribing when we should do things as opposed to who we should do those things with. I focus on fundraising because that is my world, but let's face it, the rest of the organization is pretty cool too. So I just wanted to give you a quick glimpse into some of the stuff that we store or do data analysis on. I don't get to touch it, but it is stuff that we do. So Obviously, there's a lot of GIS data. So all of you GIS nerds out there, you can just imagine in terms of the flight data, in terms of sending out the aircraft, all of that stuff, where things are happening, GIS becomes really important from that. Obviously, we have a lot of flight data, and that's not just, we're going from A to B, but it's, it's flying aircraft. It's knowing how efficient those aircraft are, how, what downtime is for maintenance, things like that. So we have to be constantly on top of that, because we don't want to be in a situation where somebody calls and needs us and we have to go, you know what, we have to do maintenance on all of our helicopters right now, so we're down for the next 8 hours. Like, we don't want to be in that situation. So it's really important to know things like that from a safety perspective. As I said, we have a call center. So a lot of the call data comes in, and we have to track that, and we have to track the different organizations we're talking with, and those types of things. There is, of course, health data, but health data is a very protected set of data. So, you might think that I can look up anybody who might have been flown the helicopter, but in truth, and unless somebody comes to us and says, "Hey, I was flown in the helicopter," we actually don't know. And that actually puts us really different from, say, hospital foundations in the United States, where they really focus on something called grateful patient, which is basically they solicit patients and their families after they've been at hospital stays. We can't do that. We rely on people to come to us to say, "Hey, you saved my life," and which already is a cool conversation. But we can't actually access that data from any type of analysis standpoint. But we do have to track it. We do have to put it into a protected system, and we do have to share it with Alberta Health or the health authority of the province involved. Most of that high-level mission data, where we went to, whether it was a scene call, whether it was a hospital transfer, things like that, that's all stored in a data warehouse, and we use Microsoft Power BI for most of that stuff. So that's the type of dashboarding we do from that perspective. This is going to be a really hard slide to see unless you have a really big monitor, but this is the missions, the 2019 to 2020 fiscal year. So that would be April 1st to March 31st, 2020. This is all the places that we went in Alberta and BC with our helicopters in Calgary, Edmonton, and Grand Prairie. So since 1985, we have flown over 45,000 missions, which is amazing, and just over 1,300 in Alberta last year. So yeah, at this point, it's time for questions. One thing I will plug, if you are really interested in fundraising metrics, I do have a course on Udemy. I put on a code there. So if you put in the code DataForGood, it'll work until Sunday at 11 a.m. If you want to take that course, I was able to reduce the price as much as it would let me. But you're welcome to that. It's not particularly statistics heavy. In fact, it's really focused on fundraisers. So there's a lot of time spent on even what are the measures of central tendency, just to get them to that point. But if it's of interest to you at all, you can just go on to Udemy, look for fundraising metrics, and the course is there, and just take you through kind of analyzing a campaign. So if it's the type of thing, if you want some ideas for metrics for the next Datathon, that's where it is. But I welcome questions.
Great. Well, thanks very much, Kirk. That was a fascinating look into the depths of data analytics in the fundraising area and its stars. It's wow. And we learned a lot. So I think some of these insights we can certainly bring into our datathons and work with other nonprofits kind of in the fundraising area. So I guess a few questions. I would encourage everybody to, if you have questions for Kirk, put them in the chat, and we'll pass them along at this point. Kirk, you've kind of been in the industry for quite a while, as a consultant, and then starting to work for STARS as well. I'm curious as to in what ways do you think kind of STARS is unique? Um, and kind of what would your gut tell you about that, or how would the executive team say about that? And then does the data actually reveal that?
Yeah, stars is so it's hard to classify stars because to some degree we're a disaster charity, and you will see patterns in our giving that is very disaster charity like in terms of if we fly somewhere, donations come in from that area. So there's very much that very Red Cross-ish type of fundraising. Now, of course, we do things kind of the fundraising kind of happens after the fact. Like it doesn't. If we fly somewhere, the funds raised aren't going to go to where we have already flown. It goes to fly the next mission. So it is a little bit different from the Red Cross in that standpoint. Um, there's a lot of our fundraising that is very reminiscent of hospital foundations,
Mm.
and just because of that medical piece. Um, so hospital foundations, again, like they tend to go after families of patients, again, when they have been, at least in Canada, when they've been notified that person was a patient. Um, but a lot of the storytelling is very similar to that. So where like I'm sure some people have listened to the Alberta Children's Hospital's radiothon at times, and I can't drive my car when that's on because just in tears. um it's a lot of the same type of stories, like telling these stories of hope and sometimes of loss, and just how we've done that. So there's that piece. The thing that's probably most compelling though about stars, and this we've heard from donors as well, is a lot of people see us as insurance, which is a really weird place from a fundraising standpoint. And it always comes in the you know what, I give to you because I never want to have to use you, but if I do, I want to know you're there. And it's such a weird place from a fundraiser standpoint, because even hospital foundations don't generally go through that.
Yeah.
So that's the difference. And then the other thing that's amazing is our retention. um, we have donors, like I remember one time pulling a list of the number of donors who had given 10 years consecutively, and I had to rerun it about 2 or 3 different ways because I didn't believe the number because it was so high. So we just have this brand reach that's from a Western Canada standpoint, it probably would battle the likes of like a Princess Margaret or a Sick Kids Hospital in Toronto type brand recognition, which is amazing. And it makes our jobs easier to some degree. It makes our jobs harder to some degree because there's a lot of things that we have to be very careful about what we say, because like you have such a strong brand that if you misspoke, um, you could collapse that overnight, right? So there's this give and take with that, which is really interesting.
Great. So I know we haven't, finished the year, 2020 yet, but I mean, society and most charities and most organizations, have seen dramatic shifts because of COVID, the pandemic, and various patterns of life, and you know, people being unemployed, and of course it's difficult in Alberta with the oil patch and all the rest, which adds on to that as well. But have you seen any particular trends that have arisen because of the pandemic?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things that came out very early was a lot of charities were saying that their direct mail campaigns that they sent out in the spring were getting what we called Christmas levels. So usually any mailing up until the Christmas end of year mailing, is very it's a very manageable amount, and then your end of year one is always the big mailing. And a lot of charities reporting very early, and we were similar. Um, the number of people who have donated to the mail campaigns or just online donations, or things like that has spiked dramatically. Um, we so it's interesting because charities, so the Blackbaud, who build Razor's Edge, they do a charitable giving report every year, and typically charities, about 12 to 15% of their income, or sorry, 12 to 15% of the number of gifts they get in are from online, and that has been only rising about 1% or 2% a year, um, for quite a while. We saw a massive spike in online giving again this year. That was not based on anything that we did particularly. So when we sent out the mailing in the spring, I think so we had a mailing ready to go. I think we were supposed to send in mid-March, which of course was as everything exploded. So we ended up deciding to send it out. We sent it out about a week or two later. But we were one of the first pieces of mail in market after the end times. And so it was just even interesting seeing how many people donated online from that. And I suspect it was because going to the post office with a piece of mail was just not even something that anybody wanted to do.
Yeah.
So they just decided to give online. So there was that piece. Charities are also reporting, obviously events can't happen. So there's been a massive surge in online events. We were similar. We did a few virtual events. Our events team put together an amazing concert, like 3 weeks, within about a 3-week period, that we had, I think, something like 15 country artists doing events. So virtual events became very much a thing. You're seeing a lot of like drive-in events and stuff. So there's a big shift in the event space. And then the concern, I think, for the charitable sector in general is those major gifts, those large gifts. And it's not actually the immediate concern, because a lot of times individuals or organizations do gift agreements with charities. So like 2 years ago, we might have made a gift agreement with company A that says, we're going to give you $100,000 a year for 3 years. And so those ones in gift agreements, they tend to give the money. They've already allocated it, that type of thing. It's very rare that a company rescinds on that. But the problem is the new agreements, the ones that are going to bring in money for the next 3 to 5 years, those are the ones charities are worried about. And we were already concerned because of the status of the oil and gas sector in late 2019, early 2020, and then this exacerbated the problem.
Interesting. So to sort of go beyond your kind of world at stars, we have some indications that you've done some other similar type of work in maybe different areas, and there's a question around whether you've done any work around sort of politics or elections at the municipal or provincial or federal, or maybe even Trump versus Biden. I'm not sure, but can you give us a bit of insight into maybe some other areas that you've taken your knowledge and experience and data analytics into?
Sure. Well, so I used to be involved in politics, and then I got better. But I actually was a candidate in 2008 for the federal election. I ran a campaign in 2004 for provincial candidate. I've run a few other campaigns here and there, mostly for candidates within party structure as opposed to the general elections. I did actually, so an interesting one. I ran the Get Out the Vote section and the analytics section for a Wild Rose candidate in 2-3 elections ago. It was the Huntsberger and Leach election. If you'll remember, for those of you who remember this far back in Alberta politics, this is when Danielle Smith was running for leader, and there was a candidate in central Alberta who talked about people burning in a lake of fire, which rubbed people the wrong way. And then there was I can't remember what the other comment was that the other person made, I think it was, oh, you know what? It doesn't matter. But there was a comment that just it rubbed
Yeah.
people the wrong way, and so the polling, the public polling was showing that the Wild Rose were going to win that election over the Progressive Conservatives, and actually that, you know, and after that election there was a lot of um, there was a lot of decrease in trust in public polling after that, because it said that the Wild Rose were going to win, and we were seeing the exact same things. So our numbers were so far away from our opponent that we basically figured we had it in the bag. All we needed to do was get them to the polls, and we've got this election. And so I'm running this data piece where basically, you know, for any of you who do election stuff, voters get numbers, and you are allowed to see whether or not that number has cast a ballot or not. You can't see obviously how they voted, but you are allowed to see who has voted. And so what you do is you identify your supporters, and then you have people report from the polls, and they effectively say, yeah, you know, like these numbers voted. You check against your list, and you go, oh great, all our supporters did. So we had the opposite problem. We had all of these supporters who were identified, and most of them stayed home, despite us, you know, and of course, as the day went on, we became more and more, you know, phoning them and trying to get a hold of them, trying to offer them rides to the polls, that type of thing. So we saw the overnight drop that the polls had not yet reported, and the polls that did do the overnights on election, or the night before election night, actually did eventually report that the drop that we saw. But yeah, it was super interesting, because public polling, internal polling. I have friends who were working on the opposite campaign for the progressive conservative. We were chatting after with drinks, and they were reporting the same thing. They thought it was lost, and so it was really interesting, kind of seeing that overnight drop as public reaction to not just the comments that were made, but Daniel Schmidt actually not admonishing them. As that basically took hold in the public. So that was really interesting.
Yeah.
When I ran as a candidate, so my wife actually works for Garmin. So when I ran as a candidate, so this was 2008, she got me a GPS watch, and I used it for door knocking. So I actually tracked all of my door knocking. I knew how long I was at each house. I knew how fast I was knocking. Basically I knew in a 2-hour period how many houses I could get to, how many would actually be home and be able to talk with, all of those stats. So it was really interesting even from that perspective.
Cool. Amazing, the power of data. So we're kind of coming to the end here of our time. There are some more questions, but we'll kind of end with maybe kind of a broad one in terms of what have been some of your biggest challenges, you know, in working with you know, the data at STARS, and kind of extend that into maybe recommendations for folks on the call here as to, you know, what have been your learnings, and what, you know, what things we should be looking out for that might trip us up, or things that we may not realize we should focus in on from your perspective.
It's a good question, and I'm not even sure how I'm going to answer that. I can tell you that, you know, when I was brought into STARS, it was very much they really wanted to focus on data, and all it took was a few of those quick wins, like that the changing the amount on the donation form, and all of a sudden any real resistance to data kind of went away. So there hasn't been challenges, at least in terms of convincing people of things, and doing the data work. Obviously with any type of donor data, you're dealing with information that gets stale very quickly. So less about the donation data per se, but donor data. You know, unless you're running constant data cleanup, constant national changes of address, things like that, donor data becomes very stale. So that's always a problem, and that's for every charity out there. Deduplication then becomes a massive problem, because you know, John Smith from 100 Main Street 5 years ago might be the same John Smith from, you know, 503 3rd Avenue that just donated yesterday, but we don't know.
Mhm.
And so you're always struggling with that. I would say probably the hardest thing for me at STARS has been the lack of historical data in some of the other programs. So I talked about the calendars and I talked about the lottery. A lot of that data didn't come into our donation system for many, many years. So there's people who have been buying calendars since they started, or have been buying lottery tickets since they started. And so we all of a sudden we end up with a philanthropic donation from somebody, and we cannot say to them, hey, thank you for being a new donor to STARS, because the likelihood is that we're going to get yelled at. People have been supporting us in many ways, and they don't, generally people don't see a difference between a philanthropic donation and a lottery purchase or a calendar purchase. They've simply been supporting us. So there's a data issue from that perspective. I don't have a lot of historical stuff, and because we have people who have been supporting us for years, we have to be very careful about the way that we steward our donors, and just the language that we use. So that's probably the hardest part there. If I could just speak to when I was a consultant, I think the hardest thing, and the reason consulting really ate at me over the years, was I was watching charities pay us a whole lot of money. We would come in, we'd do analysis, we'd give them recommendations, and we'd walk out the door and the charity wouldn't do it. And then many years later, there were a few cases where we ended up going back to the same charity, redoing analysis, and quite often coming up to the same conclusions. And just watching that waste. And so I kind of, maybe my advice really from that perspective for an organization like yours is, don't get discouraged if charities don't do anything with it. Charities traditionally operate on far fewer staff that they should have. And it's because people believe that it's really important to have this ratio of revenue to expenses, and like there's all this external pressure to keeping wages low, keeping number of employees minimal. Not necessarily all charities, but certainly that's public pressure to the sector in general. And so people are stretched really thin in charities. So when you give all of this this data, this recommendation, people might not use it, and it's not because they don't want to. It's usually because there just isn't the strength internally in order to actually implement it the way it needs to be implemented. So just continue to do what you do, but yeah, just understand that there are internal restrictions to some of that sometimes.
Sure. Yeah, and that kind of makes the case for us as well, as for our volunteering. We might do some work at a datathon, but some of the key is to follow up and to have people volunteer after the fact to try to help help provide the resources and to actually implement some of those sorts of things. And we've done that with a few organizations, and help to build the dashboard at the datathon and then actually implement it for them so that they could actually use it, and so on and so forth. But so thanks so much, Kirk. It's been a fantastic presentation, great insights, great depth into this particular area, and we really appreciate it. And STARS is an amazing organization, and with folks like you around, we can see that they'll have a really bright future. So thanks all of you for attending this evening. The recording of the presentation will be available, as well as the presentation deck. So we encourage you to look for that on our Data for Good meetup site. And would encourage you to look for future meetups and join us as we go forward towards our next events coming up in the next few months. So good night, take care, and we'll see you soon. Bye now.